Good evening, and welcome virtually to the New York Society Library. I'm Sarah Holliday from the library's events staff, and I'm just here briefly to say a word about tonight's presenter. This library was founded in 1754, and we're celebrating our 270th anniversary this spring. Our anniversary focus and our current exhibition, A Belief in Books, look at our founding and early history in a time when Enlightenment ideals of human rights and the pernicious custom of slavery were happening at the same time. So we're glad to include in our anniversary year today's special American history presentation. We're also grateful for the support for this event. This is a Henry S.F. Cooper Jr. lecture on early American history and literature. We're honored to have with us this evening Dr. Edda L. Fields Black, author of Combee, Harriet Tubman, the Combahee River Raid, and Black Freedom During the Civil War, which is new from Oxford University Press this month. Please purchase your copy through our friends from the Corner Bookstore. That link is in the chat. Dr. Fields Black is an associate professor at Carnegie Mellon University. Her previous book was Deep Roots: Rice Farmers in West Africa and the African Diaspora, which integrated linguistic evidence with biological and botanical studies to reconstruct a historical period prior to the earliest written sources. She's also the co-author of Rice, Global Networks and New Histories, and her research has been funded by the Ford, Mellon, Woodrow Wilson, and Annenberg Foundations, as well as by the Smithsonian Museum, among others. Remarkably, she's also the librettist and executive producer of Unburied, Unmourned, Unmarked, Requiem for Rice, a contemporary classical and multimedia symphonic work about slavery on rice plantations, which saw its New York debut at Lincoln Center in March 2023. Please do add your questions and comments to the chat at any point during the lecture, or you can see an email address to contact me directly in the room, and Dr. Fields Black will address them following the presentation. Thank you for joining us, and please enjoy this special event with Dr. Edda L. Fields Black.
Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to the New York Society Library for inviting me to talk with you today about my new book, Combee, Harriet Tubman, the Combahee River Raid, and Black Freedom During the Civil War. I am going to talk with you about what happened on June 1st and 2nd, 1863, when Harriet Tubman, her group of spies, scouts, and pilots piloted Colonel James Montgomery, the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, who were Black soldiers, and one company of the 3rd Rhode Island Heavy Artillery, which were white soldiers, up the sleepy, serpentine Combee River. The goal of the raid was to burn a pontoon bridge and to fill the regiment, the 2nd South Carolina Regiment. The Combee River was also surrounded by rice plantations, which is how I get interested in this raid. And so the Union Army was striking a blow at one of the Confederacy's breadbaskets, where rice was grown that was used to provision the Confederate troops, as well as feed Confederate citizens. So in the raid, 7 rice plantations were burned to the ground, with one house and some slave quarters spared. And 756 enslaved people liberated themselves. I argue that this was the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history and the second only to the Haitian Revolution in the history of the New World. So we are going to start from the beginning. The Combee River Raid really begins with the Battle of Port Royal. And this, on November 7th, 1861, the U.S. Navy drove its huge armada up Port Royal Sound, and the U.S. Army occupied Beaufort, Port Royal, and the Sea Islands. The planters fled as the U.S. Navy was advancing. They fled and they left all of their property behind, most importantly, the enslaved population. They attempted to take house servants, but many people were able to hide and to stay behind. Those they tried to take, they took at gunpoint often, and forced them into the interior where they took refuge. Formerly enslaved people, the descendants of the Gullah Geechee today, call this gun shoot at Bay Point because it's the time when the planters, the enslavers fled. And they were no longer enslaved. They were not free. They were contrabands of war, according to the US Army, and the Army would not return them. Now, the Combahee River is 40 miles away, where the lower Combee, where the raid took place. And the Combee planters were well aware of what's happening in Beaufort. Mary Boynton Chestnut's cousin was actually married to one of the planters, William L. Kirkland, who was raided. And we know from her diary that they were well aware of the Battle of Port Royal, not particularly upset about it, not particularly concerned, though Chestnut knew that it spelled trouble. Okay. And I also argue that enslaved laborers knew that this meant freedom. They knew that the Union Army and the Union Navy were close. They knew over this period of time that freedom was in Beaufort, and many would do everything they could and float on whatever kind of watercraft they could fashion in order to get to Beaufort and to get to freedom. It inaugurated the Port Royal experiment, which was the largest social experiment to date. You had about 8,000 formerly enslaved people, and these enslaved people were destitute, no clothing, very little shelter, very little food. Everything that would have been provided for enslaved laborers was now gone. There was Sea Island cotton in the field, which needed to be harvested, and the Union was going to harvest the cotton and use its proceeds to pay for the war effort. So it's a time when Northern teachers, missionaries, and managers came down, managers to manage the labor on the Sea Island cotton plantations. And it's also a moment when Harriet Tubman comes down. Now, it's important to make a distinction. Tubman was not a Northern volunteer. She was not a teacher or a missionary. She did not come as a superintendent of labor. She was sent by the governor of Massachusetts, Governor John Andrew, to serve as a spy for the U.S. Army, Department of the South. She also worked as a nurse in the hospitals. She worked as a cook. She was as well an entrepreneur who worked as a laundress and ran her own cook shop, as well as made gingerbread, and root beer, and hired a formerly enslaved person to sell it for her. This is how she made her living. So, and I suggest in Combee that some of her entrepreneurial pursuits, like washing clothes as a laundress for General Gilmore, Quincy Gilmore in particular, that these were subterfuges, if you will, that she was actually gathering intelligence and she was passing on intelligence by working in General Gilmore's staff, if you will. So the Port Royal experiment also sees the enlistment of Black troops, legal enlistment of Black troops. The 1st South Carolina Volunteers was the 1st South Carolina Regiment and one of the earliest in the South. The 2nd South Carolina Volunteers conducted the raid. It's important to note that unlike the Massachusetts 54th, these were all formerly enslaved men in these Black South Carolina regiments. And these formerly enslaved men are going to risk their freedom and risk their lives for the freedom of others. Okay. They're also going to leave pension files, and I'm going to talk more about pension files in a moment. Decades after the raid, their widows, their dependents will file for pensions for their military service. And those pension files became the evidentiary base of my book. They are one of the news sources that I use in this book to tell this story. So Harriet Tubman, who, as I've mentioned, was a spy, is a difficult person to research. I ran into a lot of challenges. The first of which is that Tubman's Civil War service is not described in the military record. And that shouldn't be surprising to us that this Black woman would not be written about by military commanders. You did have commanders like General Saxton, General Hunter, Colonel Montgomery, who wrote letters for Tubman in support of her efforts to get a pension. But these letters were solicited. These letters were private. This is not a part of the military record. They did say that she was a valuable spy. They did say that she was a valuable scout and a nurse. Um, so I had to be creative, and I was looking for, really had to turn over every rock to try to find Harriet Tubman and try to figure out what was her role. What role did she play in Beaufort gathering espionage? How did she do it? And what role did she play in the Combahee River Raid? And where I found it actually were in letters. And these are the letters of the sons of Northern abolitionists, remembering the Port Royal experiment and the Northern volunteers who came down to open schools, to run stores, to supervise labor. Well, one of these was a son of an abolitionist whom Harriet Tubman knew in Massachusetts. His name was James Seymour Severance, a young guy who was a Harvard student. And Severance records in his diary a conversation that he overhears. I say he overhears it because the way the diary entry is written, Edward L. Pierce, who was the architect of the Port Royal experiment, wasn't necessarily talking to Severance. He was venting. He wasn't happy. He's, speaking off the top of his head in Seymour's presence, right? And Seymour then records it in his journal. And Pierce is not happy. It's May 1st of 1865 when Severance records this journal entry. And Pierce is not happy because he has just learned that Harriet Tubman is on her way down to the Sea Islands. And he's unhappy because he doesn't want her to come, right? He says, I wrote to the people in Massachusetts, particularly John Sanborn. I asked for a man. I asked for a man to help us teach. Why are they sending her? Can she teach? Of course she can't teach. She's illiterate, right? So what good is she to me if she can't teach? And Seymour records in his journal that he speaks up, and says, well, she did a lot of good work in Maryland on the Underground Railroad. Maybe she could do similar work here. And Edward Pierce's response is, oh no, we don't want any of that underground stuff down here. She's too radical. We are following President Lincoln's gradual approach, and anyone who comes down has to follow it also. So a very telling look at what the architect of the Port Royal experiment, this biggest social experiment, humanitarian effort, is thinking about Harriet Tubman. Well, Tubman actually spends her time in downtown Beaufort. She works in refugee camps. So if you remember that Beaufort, the Sea Islands, Port Royal were occupied by the US Army, they are surrounded in the interior by Confederate-owned plantations. Okay, so these Confederate-owned plantations are still exploiting the labor of enslaved people. though the people a few miles away in Beaufort, Port Royal, and on the Sea Islands have liberated themselves. They're not yet free until July of 1862, but they will not be returned to bondage. They are under the protection of the U.S. Army. So, as I mentioned, with the people on the Combee, people in these Confederate occupied areas are trying to get to Beaufort if they can. They're taking that risk. And most of them are coming into downtown Beaufort to these refugee camps set up to receive them and to assess their needs and to then process them, sending them either to work, sending them to the Sea Islands, or sending them to a more permanent camp where they can be housed and clothed and fed if they are unable to work. This is the population among whom Harriet Tubman worked. And many also, of course, had medical needs. There's a letter from William Lloyd Garrison's son, George Garrison, in which George Garrison describes Tubman and her work in these refugee camps. He says that she debriefed freedom seekers. Now, that's not my language. That's not George Garrison's language. That's the language of the CIA, which has been studying Tubman's tactics in recent years, and looking at them in terms of the gathering of intelligence in enemy territory. So she interviewed these freedom seekers. She talked to them. She found out what they saw and heard and smelt and witnessed in Confederate occupied territory, about Confederate truth strengths, about Confederate armaments, things like that, troop movements. And according to George Garrison, Tubman was able to gather more intelligence than anyone else. So very interesting that the sons of the abolition movement could see Tubman in ways that other people could not. Tubman, in her pension file, tells us what her role was as a spy. And she receives a pension as a widow. Harriet Tubman remarried after the war to a man who was a Civil War veteran by the name of Nelson Davis. And so Harriet Davis applies for her husband's pension after his death, and she receives it. And in this general affidavit, she's describing her own military service, saying that she was the leader of men, 8 or 9. These men were spies, scouts, and pilots. Now, some of my new research, first of all, identifies Tubman's spies, scouts, and pilots, particularly Mott Blake, Isaac Hayward, and Jack Burns. These were men who left a paper trail. I tried very hard. I could not trace all of them. And there's one more, I'm forgetting his name. Walter, it'll come back to me. I apologize. I just had a momentary brain fog. So I was able to identify 4 of Tubman's spies, scouts, and pilots. The rest of them sort of disappear after the war, which could mean a number of things. I'll talk in a minute about Isaac Hayward, and I'm happy to talk about the others in the question and answer period if anyone would like to know more. What we do know is that, and this is additional new evidence that I was able to uncover in Combee, that the Combee River was mined with torpedoes, okay? And Tubman's spies, scouts, and pilots, with her spies, scouts, and pilots, Tubman was able to find the men, the enslaved men, whom the Confederate soldiers, whose labor the Confederate soldiers exploited to lay these torpedoes and to supervise these same men going back on the Combee River and removing the torpedoes. So this opened up the Combee River to the U.S. Army, according to Tubman's nephew, and according to interviews that Tubman gave later in her life. So this is one of her main contributions of the raid, is gathering this kind of intelligence. The raid is at which the raid is actually based on. And her role is a role of espionage versus a more active fighting role in the military. So as I thought about how I wanted to tell this story, it was very important to me to try to make it as authentic as possible. And I'm going to talk about some of my efforts to do so. I'm also going to show some of my efforts. So you're going to see several photographs by an eminent photographer, J. Henry Fair. He is an environmental conservation photographer, as well as a climate change activist and a native of the Combahee River. And so Henry took aerial, terrestrial, and drone photographs of the river, of sites along the river, and sites on the Combee plantations. And Henry had been photographing the Combee for decades. So some of the images were already a part of his portfolio. Others he took specially for my book. And his photographs are printed in the book. So what we're seeing here is downtown Beaufort. This is the wharf. This is where the Combee Raid actually began. And 3 U.S. Army boats left Beaufort at 9 p.m. On June 1st of 1863. And if you think about the summertime, when the days are very long, by 9 p.m. it's dark, and it takes 9 p.m. for it to actually get dark. So they are leaving under darkness, but also under the light of the full moon. It was a full moon, and it was also a spring tide, which meant that these were the highest high tides of the lunar cycle. And in theory, those higher high tides facilitated getting these large boats up this very curly river, as people call it in the region. Okay, so even though it's the spring tide and the tides are higher than they are normally, the tidal amplitude, one of the boats ran aground. So Tubman's spy scouts and pilots decided to take a risk and to go up the Coosaw River versus going around to St. Helena Sound. Now, it was a risky maneuver that saved time, and time was of the essence. They had the advantage of darkness. They had the advantage of surprise. The Confederate forces did not know they were coming, and they wanted to maximize that advantage and minimize their exposure to Confederate fire on the river. And they had no idea what the Confederate troop strength was in the area. But it was risky because the mouth of the Coosaw River is lined with sandbars. The Coosaw is known to be a river that has a lot of sandbars. And one of the ships ran aground. One of the transport steamers ran aground. Now, I argue that one of Tubman's spy scouts and pilots, Isaac Hayward, may have influenced this decision to take the shortcut up the Coosaw River. Hayward, in his Freedman's Bank account, and this is one of my favorite documents in the book. First of all, his Freedman's Bank account says that he is born on the Coosaw Island, on the Coosaw River. He's a boatman, and he's raised in Beaufort. Secondly, he said that William C. Hayward, who is one of the Combee planters whose plantation was destroyed in the raid, that William C. Hayward was his father. He claims to be the illegitimate son, and he's described as biracial, the illegitimate son of William C. Hayward. So it's possible, and there are a couple reasons why I conclude that William C. Hayward was the target of the raid. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the question and answer. So it must have been heartbreaking for these men, all of whom were formerly enslaved, the spy scouts and pilots, the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, and Harriet Tubman herself, to lose the Sentinel, which was a transport steamer, which would have doubled their capacity to bring freedom seekers down from the plantations to freedom. So now they only had one transport steamer, which was the Harriet A. Weed, and they could only take half as many people. So that must have been heartbreaking. But they also gained time and they maintained their advantage, and they were able to get through the Coosaw River, the 2 boats, and up the Combee River, pretty far up the Combee River before daylight. So another way that I tried to tell the story authentically was to get to know as much about the river as I possibly could. And I'm not a sailor. I'm not someone who grew up on boats. So my learning curve was pretty steep. We reenacted the raid 3 times, different segments of the raid. And the second time we went out in daylight during the day, using all of the modern gadgets and attempting to start in downtown Beaufort and go through the Coosaw River up to the Combee Ferry, which is where the raid ended. We also ran aground at the mouth of the Coosaw River coming back. So the Coosaw is kind of notorious and it has earned its reputation. So only someone who knew the river very well, I think, would attempt to go through it, especially under the cover of darkness, even under the light of the full moon. Okay, so here's a shot of the river under the light of the full moon. After the Sentinel ran aground.
Dr. Fields Black, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm afraid the screen share is not sharing your screen at the present time. So I'm afraid we are not able to see the images that you're referring to.
Have I not been sharing this whole time?
I'm sorry, I fear not.
Oh no. Okay. Oh dear. Okay, there we go. All this time using Zoom, and you think we would get it right. Okay, how about?
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry that. Let's start here. Okay, so this is downtown Beaufort. Oh, I can't believe that. All right. This is the mouth of the Coosaw River. And then this is the Combee River. All right, the Combee River under the full moon. 2 boats continued up the river. After the Sentinel ran aground, the John Adams, which was a gunboat, and the Harriet A. Reid, which was a transport steamer. Harriet Tubman, her men, Colonel James Montgomery, were all in the lead boat. They were on the John Adams, we know. And I've been able to confirm that with new research and new documents that I found. So in my quest to try to learn more about the river, the first time we reenacted the raid, we actually went at night under the full moon with no modern gadgets, including lights, traveling 6 to 7 miles per hour, and this would be the rate at which the boats traveled, and really trying to recreate those conditions of the raid. And it's interesting because I was traveling with a group of scientists, a botanist, an ecologist. We did several reenactments together. And it was interesting that the water, the moonlight shimmered off of the water. So on each side of the water, the rice fields on one side and the marsh on the other, these were two undifferentiated dark masses, but the water in the middle would glimmer and shimmer in the moonlight. And as I've mentioned, and as you can see, the Combee is a very serpentine river. It winds a lot. And some of the curves or curls, as people of the region would call it, form an oval. And it's as if the two sides of the oval are quite close to touching. Okay. And so to navigate this river at night, even under the full moon, is rather challenging. And one of the lessons that I learned as I drove the boat back was to steer in the middle, right? You have to steer in the middle. That's where the water is deepest. It's on either edge of the river where the water is more shallow and the sandbars are more prevalent. So learning how to steer that river, again, these are people who had to know the river, right? They had to know the river to attempt to do something like this at night. They had to know the tides and know how important those tides are to everything that happens on the river and in that region. And I would argue that they knew these plantations as well. Okay, so here's a look from this portion of the river. You can see what I'm saying about the two sides coming close to meeting. It's almost like it's a C that's almost closing. And in this image as well from Bonnie Hall Refuge, what you see in the right foreground, those are the rice fields. And then if you look in the background, that's the marsh. So the rice fields on one side and the marsh on the other. As they passed, the two boats first made two stops, one at Fields Point and one at Tar Bluff. And at each stop, one company and its commander, one company of the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, got out and remained on these two stops. There were Confederate pickets at Fields Point, and there's a newspaper article that says that those pickets fled when they saw the Black troops carrying muskets, and they fled so quickly that they left their blankets warm and they left their blankets behind. They fell back and sent couriers to send reinforcements. There were skirmishes at both Fields Point and Tar Bluff, and there's a road that goes from Fields Point all the way up to Green Pond, to one of the areas where there were Confederate reinforcements. And so there were skirmishes along that road. But these two companies of the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers held it down. They were there by themselves all day until the boats came back to pick them up. So as the two boats proceed up the Combee River, one of the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers captains described what he saw as woolly heads, and that's a quote, hard at work in the rice fields, okay, as they headed north along the Combee. It was 4 a.m. Now, I mentioned that 9 p.m. in June in coastal South Carolina, it is dark. It is pitch dark. Okay. 4 a.m. It is still pitch black dark. And one of my, recon, reenactment efforts was to go outside at 4 a.m. under the full moon and see what I could see. And I'm here to tell you, I could not see my hand in front of my face. So that means that the enslaved people who had to walk a mile from most of the slave quarters, walking a mile down to the rice fields so that they are in the rice fields at 4 a.m. Could have been walking through snakes, right? Snakes in the grass during that walk. Then once they're in the rice field, standing in probably ankle deep water, okay? Alligators, as well as snakes, water moccasins, as well, and alligators, and then copperheads in the grass. So this was dangerous work. For many reasons, the Low Country was an extremely unhealthy region for white people, but also for Black people. And working in this environment was very unhealthy for people. So one of the quote unquote woolly heads that Colonel William Lee Apthorpe saw in the rice fields was 88-year-old Minus Hamilton. And Minus Hamilton was the oldest of the old heads on record to have escaped what I call, and I took it from Frederick Douglass, the prison house of bondage in the Combahee River Raid. Minus Hamilton remembered that an hour or two before day clean, as the Gullah Geechee would call it, and I quote, "De people was all a hoeing, massa. There was a hoeing in the rice field when the gunboats come," unquote. Then, quote, "every man drapped him hoe and left the rice," unquote. I learned in my reenactment that the enslaved laborers must have stood with their feet and ankles sunk deep in muck and water between the multi-shade green rows of maturing rice. Water from the stretch flow had been drained off before they were sent in to hoe, but it's impossible to evacuate all of the water. So small amounts must have remained in the fields. Being underwater for 5 or 6 weeks left the ground swampy and quicksand-like. Soft stems of algae growing up between the rows of rice would have felt prickly under their feet and added to the collage of greens. After enslaved laborers put their toes and the ball of their foot down on the ground, their heels sank deep into the swampy muck. The faster they walked, the more they sank down and slipped on the steam spinach-like algae floating in the water. This melange of sinking muck and slippery algae would have hindered enslaved laborers running through and climbing quickly out of the rice fields and onto the dikes, which are the embankments around the rice fields. And this was also a lesson from our reenactment, because with my scientist colleagues and friends, we walked barefoot through the rice fields. And I'm someone who has spent more than 2 decades in rice fields in West Africa and in the Low Country, and I had never been barefoot in the rice fields before. And I've already talked about the snakes and alligators, so I don't want to talk about them anymore, except to say that as we were standing there, and as I was figuring out how slippery it was and how prickly it was, and how impossible it would be for someone like Minus Hamilton to run through the rice fields to the boat, a baby alligator appeared in the rice field. And my scientist friends were joking about the baby alligator. And because I, had to study up a little bit on alligators and how to avoid them, I knew the mother alligator wasn't far behind. That was my suspicion. So I tried to hightail it out of the rice fields, only to find out that my theory was wrong, that in fact, they, enslaved people trying to get to the boat likely did not run through the rice fields. That would be a very difficult thing to do. And then even trying to climb up and out onto the main dike was difficult. I had to be pulled up because it was such a tall step. So this was quite an ordeal for people. Went through a lot, to get out of these rice fields and get to the boat. But once they were able to extricate themselves and their loved ones from the morass, running along the main dike, which held back the Combee River from the rice fields, was the quickest path to what formerly enslaved people called Lincoln's gunboats. So Minas Hamilton continues. He says that the overseer stood in the rice field and called to the enslaved field hands working there to run to the woods and hide. He's saying, run and hide. He told them the Yankees had finally come and would sell them all to Cuba. They must immediately run for hide. But Hamilton and the enslaved laborers working with him did not feign attachment to the enslaver or obedience to the overseer. Instead, they did the opposite of what they were ordered to do. According to Mr. Hamilton, every man he run, and my God, he run all the other way. The overseer ran to the woods alone. From his hiding place, he looked, peep, back at the enslaved people, and he looked, peep again. He demanded the enslaved people one last time, run for hide, run for hide. The enslaved people over whom the overseer held the power to work and torture to death utterly disregarded his authority. Every man run by him, and they ran for their lives to freedom, straight to the boat. One of my proudest moments, I should say that Minas Hamilton's account was one of the first I found. And he's telling his life story. He's telling his story of liberating himself and his family in the Combahee River Raid to Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was the commander of the 1st South Carolina Volunteers. And he tells it a few weeks after the Combahee Raid and right after the 1st South Carolina had finished an expedition on Edda. It was one of the first documents, if you will, that I found. And of course, because it has to do with rice and talks about the enslaved people being in the rice fields, and really centered it for me, the Combahee Raid as a rice story, was something that I treasured and I hung on to, and became, one of, not so much what inspired me to write the book, but something that it was a puzzle that I wanted to figure out. I wanted to know who was Minas Hamilton's family. Where was he enslaved? How does this 88-year-old man end up in a rice field? And in this rice field, in order to be a witness, maybe one of the first witnesses to these boats, the U.S. Army boats. And one of my proudest research moments was finding his family. So he escaped with his wife, Hagar, his daughter, Bina, his son-in-law, Harry, and his granddaughter, Hagar. And Hamilton likely considered himself very lucky. As I've mentioned, he was a pretty elderly man, even by today's standards. And yet he was blessed to live long enough to see Black soldiers, something that he likely never thought he would do. And to Hamilton, these young Black, formerly enslaved men were "De black soldiers so presumptuous," he called them in a perfect Gullah dialect. And Colonel Higginson really took pains to record Hamilton's speech, because they came to confront enslavement and enslavers head on. They disembarked the Yankee gunboats and came right ashore wearing the U.S. Army issue blue coats and carrying loaded muskets. The young, proud Black men who had been formerly enslaved like him stood tall and proud with their backs straight and, quote, held their heads up. When he says this, he's just in awe of them. Then they went to work destroying the manifestations of wealth Combee enslavers had starved, whipped, and exploited from the Black people they held in bondage. I have one more thing that I want to share with you, and that is the pension files, which are really the core of the book. The fact that the soldiers, the 2nd South Carolina volunteer soldiers, the 150 men the day after the raid, the day after they liberate themselves in the raid from enslavement on the Combee. These Combee men join the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. And decades after their service, they, their widows, their dependents apply for pensions. And these pension files are a treasure trove that historians really have not used other than to talk about the lives of individual people. And as I analyzed the files of the 2 regiments that enlisted the day after the raid, I was able to reconstruct the enslaved community, because people testified about their family members, their marriages, their weddings, the births of their children, their experiences during slavery. They also testify about the Combahee River Raid. So most of the main characters in the book are people who somehow told their stories about the raid, like Minus Hamilton. And I used the pension files and a host of other documents to trace that group of people back into slavery and then forward into freedom. So here we see Primus Barnwell testifying for his sister, Relia Middleton, and talking about his brother-in-law's service. Primus was a child. He was too young to serve, but he remembered hearing what the older men said, and he recounted their memories. So I'm going to skip. This sketch was printed in Harper's Weekly on July 4th, 1863. So it's a sketch of the raid, and you can see how different this sketch looks, how different the river and the rice fields look from even the slave cabin down there in the corner. Would not have been that close from the photographs that I showed you of the aerial photographs taken by J. Henry Fair. At the bottom of this image was an image of a man by the name of Gordon. And the image is in 3 parts. So first, Gordon as he entered our lines is the caption, Gordon under medical examination, and he enters the lines, the U.S. lines, wearing rags, right? He's an enslaved person. Secondly, he's been examined by the Army doctor, Army surgeon, and the lacerations on his back are discovered. And then the third is Gordon in uniform as a U.S. soldier. So it's interesting, the juxtaposition of these 2 images, the Combee Raid on top, 756 people freed, 150 men enlisted in the U.S. Army, and Gordon on the bottom. So historians have questioned Gordon's identity. Was he a real person? Was this actually 3 people who have been depicted as one, or was this one person? I would argue, I'm suggesting that the 150 men who enlisted in the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers were all Gordon. That the 135,000 enslaved men who fought in the U.S. colored troops were all Gordon. The 2nd South Carolina Volunteers had taken the men out of the rice fields. They took the hose out of their hands. They put muskets in them. And they went on to fight for the freedom of others. And with Harriet Tubman and the spy scouts and pilots, the Black spy scouts and pilots on which the U.S. military depended during the Civil War, they all risked their life for freedom. Not only their freedom, because they knew that freedom was not free, but the freedom of people who were still in bondage, even after the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. Thank you.
Dr. Fields Black, thank you so much. That was fascinating, just really so much that I was not familiar with before. And I'm just going to read a comment that I got here from one of the participants. This is an amazing account. I am learning so much and look forward to reading the book. Thank you for sharing your research with us this day. This person goes on to say, this makes me see the recent South Carolina primaries in a new light, and also to wonder if Carolina brand rice, which is of course a common supermarket brand now, does this have a connection to this history or this place?
Yes, it absolutely does. Well, I should say that Carolina Gold was the variety that was very popular and widely grown during the antebellum period. There is sort of a resurgence of growing Carolina Gold now. And I should say that the rice fields that you saw, most of those rice fields, all of those rice fields, people no longer grow rice in them. Those are tidal fields, and they require a lot of maintenance to maintain the irrigation system. These days, when the irrigation system is maintained, it's mainly for waterfowl. And so these are hunting preserves, right? These are plantations where people hunt. Sometimes they're hunting clubs. Most of them are still private property. So rice is not grown there, but in the inland swamps is where people have begun to grow Carolina Gold again. And it's really more of a boutique crop. Yes, some people grow it for consumption, but it's more like, I've never seen it in Whole Foods, but if you go to more of a Epicurean, right, especially in the South, that's the kind of place where you might find Carolina Gold.
Fascinating. Can you, referencing a question from the chat here, can you speak a little more about the number of people and how they would have been organized on the boats? So what is the role of the pilot and how many people are there in charge of the boat versus number of passengers? Do you have
I don't think we have a very good sense of that. What we do know is that the John Adams had a relatively small hold. So a relatively small number of people could crowd in there, and it had 2 pilot houses. That particular
pilot,
boat,
I'm sorry, the pilot is the navigator?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, the pilot is the one who's driving the boat up the river, and probably on I call it a steering wheel. I don't know what the thing is called, on the wheel. The John Adams was actually a New England ferry boat. So these U.S. Army boats, this was not the U.S. Navy. This was not the state-of-the-art armada that came up Port Royal Sound and blew the Confederate Navy out of the water. This was not them. These were a bunch of ragtag boats that the U.S. Army bought on New England shipyards, brought them south, and tricked them out to be gunboats.
Well, it worked out.
It worked out. They had small guns, and kind of painted on armor, but it's more than what the Confederates had.
There you go. So I'm fascinated to hear about the CIA studying Harriet Tubman's techniques. So it just makes me think of a way that we don't conventionally talk about this, maybe that she was not only very successful, but she was innovative as a spy.
Yes. Yes.
And I assume that she must have had a prodigious memory. I mean, just because that must be an essential technique for a spy in general to collect all this intelligence and keep it in your head. Can you talk a little bit of your research on that? And
Yeah. We really still don't know how she did it. But I agree with you. And her memory was not only, and of course, this is a person who wasn't lettered, right? So she couldn't read. But she had to have a memory for people, for faces and voices, but also to be able to read and remember the environment, to be able to navigate, without a map, let alone GPS, to and to be able to, of course, survive and know how to survive in a landscape, but also be able to get back to that landscape, right?
yeah,
And know how to navigate to and from and around, to have that memory. And much of the time when she's on the Underground Railroad, she traveled during the winter time. But one can imagine she didn't always travel during the wintertime. One can imagine that the same place will look vastly different in different seasons, right? So, and the same place will have different things growing, different animals, who are hibernating or not hibernating, or mating or not mating, or whatever. To know all of that
and avoid
and
the
to keep
alligators.
it, yeah, oh my gosh. And then to sort of learn to read the landscape in the Maryland Eastern Shore, and then to come south and read a different landscape in South Carolina.
Really remarkable.
Mhm.
Um, so there have been some fictionalized treatments of Tubman over the last few years. I mean, obviously the Cynthia Erivo film, but also Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Water Dancer.
Yes.
Are there any of these that you like or have thoughts about? And do you feel like this sort of thing romanticizes Tubman and the Underground Railroad in a way that's good for historical memory, for those of us who aren't professional historians but just want a taste of the thing? Or
Yeah, I have to say, Ta-Nehisi Coates's The Water Dancer was one of my inspiration books. I think it's exceedingly well done. And what I took from it was the fact that Tubman is a central character. She's a central figure, and her presence sort of looms large over the entire story. But she's not the main character. She's not the leading character, if you will. It's not a story about her. And very much in Combee, she is one of the leading characters, but there's a lot of characters. Right, I call it Tubman and the Freedom Seekers. It's like she's the lead singer, but she's got her band with her.
yes.
And one of the leading figures, the leading man, if you will, is Minus Hamilton. So I really, in addition to just being so beautifully written, I really appreciated how he pulled that off, because usually it has to be totally about Tubman. I think that, I have my thoughts about the Harriet biopic. And as a historian, I love film, and I love film that's historical. I always have a lot to say about the poetic license that the artists take. But anything that brings people to the history, I think, is valuable. And once we can get their appetites wet, then maybe we can, fill in the facts. I will say that that last scene is supposed to be the Combee Raid, and it's wrong. It's completely wrong.
That's got to be frustrating, and maybe satisfying to be able to learn the real facts. Then that's very
The
good.
real facts, yes.
So if it encourages people to go and learn about it, then it's positive.
Exactly. Watch the film, get the book.
So I might toss just a couple more questions at you, if that's good.
Sure.
So I think we were all struck by your description of walking barefoot through of really thinking about the place, not just the geography or topography, but how it would have actually been experienced by the people there. Do you feel like not doing that is a weakness of past histories of this time and place, or just period? And in particular, where you permit your discoveries in that way to kind of challenge the written record and say, well, it was really dark, so let's take that into account and not just take this at face value that somebody's describing what they saw. Or
Yeah. Well, I'll say this. I'll save a couple of things. Being an academic historian has its challenges. And the book is written for a trade audience, and I didn't necessarily know how to make that leap from writing for an academic audience to writing for a trade audience. So this is part of how I imagined, and these are things that the trade books that I like to read do and do very well. And that is to try to make the reader feel as if they are there, like they are experiencing this thing you're writing about. That's number one. Number two, I felt as if biographies of Tubman that talked about this period in her life when she's in Beaufort kind of glossed over the differences between coastal South Carolina and the Maryland Eastern Shore. And there's a whole bunch of diversity within coastal South Carolina between the Sea Islands and the rice plantations. We can just stop there. There's more, but I'll just leave it at that. And then these two areas are different. Each is different from the Maryland Eastern Shore. There are similarities. And so the biographies focus on those similarities, but there's so many differences. And I would say, well, if they're so similar, then why weren't they growing rice on the Chesapeake, right? And why weren't they growing tobacco in the Low Country? If they're that similar, and the truth is they're not. They're really not. And I actually think it's more powerful to think about Tubman learning this environment and learning to read the environment, right, in Maryland, and then not going to South Carolina and finding the same environment, but using her skills to navigate a different environment. So it's not the environment that's transferable, it's her skills of navigation, of survival, of et cetera. You asked about snakes. So one of the other things I did not mention, and this is a constant for me because I'm an avid walker. And as I mentioned, I specialized in rice. And so I had spent a lot of time in rice fields in South Carolina, for a couple of years before Combee with this group of scientists, with my scientist friends. We're tramping around the rice fields. But I was privileged to be in residence on the Combee. So I partnered with Nemours Wildlife Foundation, which is located on the Combee. And it's a very large, 12,000 acres or so. One of the former plantations that's a part of that research center was raided by the Combee Raid. For about 18 months, I stayed at Nemours every month for about 10 days. And being an avid walker, I would hike in the rice fields. I was also privileged, and this really comes from my work on rice plantations, to meet and be introduced to the current owners of most of these plantations. They're private property, right? And I was able to gain access many times, really whenever I asked, as long as it wasn't hunting season, to be able to go on the property, to walk in the rice fields, with my scientist colleagues, and with the property managers, as well as with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We would be out there measuring. It's like, how far is it? Okay, the slave cabins are over here. How far is it to the river? Really trying to map the primary sources onto the land. And it wasn't so much that I found the primary sources to be inaccurate. My theories were often wrong. I had a lot of theories. And when I tested them, they were wrong, and I figured it out. But there were times when I didn't quite understand what they were talking about. So the U.S. Army, one of the Confederate pickets, is writing about what he saw, and I believe he's talking about why he didn't call the gunboat, why he didn't, send a courier sooner once he realized this was a U.S. gunboat. It had to be a U.S. gunboat. The Confederates didn't have gunboats over there. And he says the night was bright. It's like, oh, okay. It's the full moon. It's like, oh, the night is bright. I get it. Or they're talking about the tide, and well, everybody talks about the tide, but why this tide was special? Because it was the spring tide. Okay. So being in the region, and really getting to know the region much more intimately than I even did before really helped. It really, I think, helped me to put the reader on the ground.
That's fantastic. So this may just show the lack of my personal education. This is a question for me, but I just can't help wondering if this is the largest rebellion of enslaved people in U.S. history, which I think is what you said at the very beginning. How come we don't hear about it more in kind of standard textbooks and so forth? We're always hearing about, say, Nat Turner, not to,
Right.
But is it because this one was successful and was not put down with violence, for instance?
Right. I think so. Yes, and I think it's because it took place during the Civil War.
So it's just, everybody assumes it's just part of the process of the war rather than being action by enslaved people that was separate from yeah.
And I think, we're still grappling with enslaved people as historical actors. We're still grappling with the Civil War, of course. I mean, that's, that's ongoing and rather recent. And really trying to understand the lengths and the risks people were willing to take to be free. Mm-hmm. And the fact that they weren't waiting for President Lincoln, they weren't waiting for Congress, they weren't waiting for the Emancipation Proclamation, which didn't free most of them, right? People who could seize their freedom, and they took it in their own hands, and so that by the end of the war, 500,000 formerly enslaved people are behind U.S. lines. Historian James Oakes says that means that the end of slavery was inevitable by that time. The institution is dead. So we're still coming to grips with that, and I think that the fact that it was successful, the fact that so many people were freed, the fact that it happened during the Civil War, and that it happened under the auspices of the U.S. Army, right? That it's the U.S. Army that conducted this raid. and that these are formerly enslaved people who executed it.
Mhm.
We've got to deal with all of that.
Yeah. So would it be fair to make a very blanket statement along the lines of the Union effort as a whole is not freeing the slaves, but setting up a structure wherein the enslaved people can free themselves?
Yes, I think that's accurate. I think most historians would agree with that.
Yeah, and yet
Yeah.
it's not the way that at least, I mean, my education is in primary education, and this is sometime in the past, but I think it's not how we primarily think of that unless we read excellent books like yours. So I think we'll wrap up there unless there's anything else you would like to add that didn't get to be mentioned earlier.
No, I think we've covered a lot of ground. I'm sorry my early slides did not show, but I think the audience got a good taste of the Combee.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Edda Fields Black. Audience members, I'm just going to mention our upcoming events tomorrow night. We've got Marlon James in the library, and then we've got a panel of distinguished biographers, including Kitty Kelly, coming up on March 5th, and a terrific online event just like this one in structure, except it's about the Revolutionary War and revolutionaries and loyalists in New York City. Of course, that again relates to this library's history, as well as the history of the city and the country. So do come back and join us for that. And thank you so much, Dr. Fields Black. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you for having me.